Imagine this. It is November 1099 AD. You are standing at the edge of the North Sea coast, somewhere along what we now call the Netherlands and England. The wind is cold, but familiar. The tide has come and gone 100 times this year, just like it always has. You've lived your whole life here, on land so flat you can see the horizon in every direction. The sea is not your enemy. The sea is your neighbor. You fish it, trade on it, pray facing it. Your children are asleep. Your fire is low. Outside, the water is doing what water always does, rising and falling with the moon, obedient and ancient and utterly predictable. And then, sometime before dawn, it stops being predictable. The storm surge hits the coast not like a wave. There is no dramatic crash of water, no towering wall you can see coming and run from. Just a silent, rising, unstoppable push of the sea across the land. Within minutes, fields become lakes. Within an hour, villages simply cease to exist. No warning bell reaches the people in time. No one escapes by running because there is nowhere to run. The land is flat for miles, in every direction. You don't hear it coming. That is the most terrifying part. This is the story of the saint. Clement's Day flood of 1099, one of the deadliest natural disasters in medieval European history. A catastrophe so complete that it reshaped coastlines, erased entire communities, and then was almost entirely forgotten. Almost. To understand how devastating November 1099 was, you first need to understand what medieval coastal Europe actually looked like. And I promise you it looked nothing like what you picture when you close your eyes and imagine the Middle Ages. Forget the castles, forget the knights, forget the sprawling stone cathedrals you've seen in photographs. The majority of people living in 11th century England and the Low Countries, what is now the Netherlands, Belgium, and northern France, were not nobility. They were farmers, fishermen, salt workers, and traders who lived in low-lying communities built directly onto reclaimed marshland and tidal flats. They were not primitive people. They were extraordinarily resourceful engineers. For centuries, coastal communities had been building a remarkable system of earthen dikes, drainage channels, and raised mounds called terpen, artificial hills, constructed specifically so that people could live above the floodplain. Along the English coast, settlements hugged the estuaries of rivers like the Thames, the Humber, the Wash Basin. In what is now the Netherlands, entire communities existed on land that technically sat below the mean high tide line, protected by nothing but hand-built earthen walls and centuries of accumulated knowledge about how the sea behaved. The year 1099 itself had already been one of the most violent in recorded history, and not because of nature. The First Crusade had just concluded. Jerusalem had fallen to Crusader forces in July of that year, in a siege so brutal that contemporary chroniclers described rivers of blood flowing through the streets of the Holy City. All of Europe was buzzing with religious fervor, political upheaval, and the particular kind of exhausted triumph that follows years of organized slaughter. People were not thinking about the sea. The 23rd of November, 1099, the Feast of Street Clement, was, by all historical accounts, a perfectly ordinary, late autumn day. Street Clement was the patron saint of sailors and mariners, the third Pope of Rome, who according to tradition was executed by being tied to an anchor and thrown into the sea, which is why the anchor became his symbol, and why sailors claimed him as their own. His feast day was celebrated with modest church services, the lighting of bonfires in some traditions, and the kind of communal gathering that marked most medieval holy days. Communities along the coast of England and the Low Countries gathered, prayed, ate, and returned to their homes as the evening grew cold. Here is what they did not know. A catastrophic storm system, the kind of deep, fast-moving depression that meteorologists today would classify as a North Sea storm surge event, had been building across the northern Atlantic. These storms are not unusual in November. The North Sea is, climatically speaking, a funnel. Winds from the north push enormous volumes of water southward into a narrowing basin. When those winds are strong enough and sustained long enough, the water has nowhere to go. It piles up, it rises, and when it finally meets a coastline, it does not arrive as a storm. It arrives as an elevation. The entire sea level simply goes up. Medieval coastal defenses, those beautifully engineered dikes and earthen walls, were built to handle predictable tidal variation. They were built to handle storms. They were not built to handle a sea that simply decided, for several hours, to be 4, 5, or 6 feet higher than it had ever been in living memory. The terpen mounds that had protected Dutch coastal communities for generations, the floodwater topped them. The English coastal dikes along the Thames estuary and the Wash, overtopped and undermined within minutes. The people who had gone to sleep on the eve of Street Clement's feast never understood what was happening. By the time the water reached their doors, it was already at their windows. One detail from later chronicles stands out with quiet horror. The bodies found in the aftermath were not found drowned in fields or on roads. Many were found inside their homes, in their beds, in the upper rafters of barns. People had climbed as high as they could. It wasn't high enough, and the flood wasn't even close to finished yet. Because what no one realized in that first terrible night was that the water was still rising. In fact, the worst was still hours away. Here is the myth that most history textbooks quietly maintain: that medieval people died in natural disasters because they were ignorant, superstitious, and helpless. That the death toll was high because these were primitive communities that didn't understand science or risk management. That is, to put it plainly, completely wrong. The communities that died on the 23rd of November, 1099, were not ignorant. They were managing one of the most sophisticated hydraulic engineering systems in the pre-industrial world. The Dutch, in particular, had been fighting the sea for longer than most civilizations had existed. Their knowledge of tidal patterns, seasonal storm behavior, and flood management was generational, passed down through families, the way other cultures pass down songs or sacred text. These were people who understood water better than almost anyone on Earth. What they could not survive was scale. And the scale of the 1099 flood was simply outside the range of anything that existing infrastructure, human memory, or recorded history had prepared them for. Let's talk numbers, because the numbers, when you actually sit with them, are staggering. Contemporary and near-contemporary English chronicles, including the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, one of the most reliable historical documents of the period, record the flood with language that is uncharacteristically emotional for a medieval scribe. The entry for 1099 describes the sea flooding many townships and killing more people and livestock than anyone could count. That phrase, more than anyone could count, in a document written by professional scribes trained in precise record-keeping, tells you something about what the aftermath must have looked like. Estimates from later historians, cross-referencing settlement records, church registries, and land grant documents that suddenly stopped being renewed after 1099, suggest that somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000 people may have died in this single event across the combined coastlines of England and the Low Countries. Those numbers are disputed, as all medieval casualty figures are. But even the conservative estimates, 50,000 dead, make this one of the deadliest natural disasters in European history, before the Black Plague. Now pause for a second and think about what 50,000 people means in 1099. The entire population of London at this time was approximately 10,000 to 15,000 people. Paris, the largest city in Western Europe, held perhaps 20,000. The total population of England was somewhere between 1.5 million and 2 million people. 50,000 deaths in a single night represented the equivalent of wiping out 3 or 4 Londons simultaneously, not from plague, not from war, but from water. The physical reshaping of the land was equally dramatic. In what is now the Netherlands, the floodwater that poured across the coastal lowlands did not simply recede cleanly. It carved new channels. It connected previously separate bodies of water. The formation of the Zuiderzee, the large inland sea that would dominate Dutch geography for centuries, was not the work of a single storm, but of a long sequence of catastrophic North Sea floods across the 10th through 14th centuries. The 1099 flood was one of the earliest and most violent chapters in that sequence. Later floods, particularly the catastrophic Lucia's flood of 1287, which killed an estimated 50,000 to 80,000 people in a single night, dramatically expanded what had begun forming in 1099 until the Zuiderzee reached its full extent. It remained an open sea until Dutch engineers finally reclaimed it in the 20th century. In England, the floodwaters poured inland through the Thames estuary, the Humber, and the Wash, three of the largest coastal inlets on the eastern seaboard. Low-lying areas around modern-day Lincolnshire, Norfolk, and the Thames Delta were inundated. Churches were lost. Entire parishes simply disappeared from the historical record after 1099, their populations never rebuilt, their names surviving only in obscure land registers. One contemporary observer, a monk writing from a monastery, safely situated on higher ground, described looking out from the hillside at dawn, the morning after the flood, and seeing, where there had been villages the day before, only an expanse of still, grey water stretching to the horizon. He wrote that it looked like the sea had simply reclaimed what had always been its own. What do you think when you hear about a disaster wiping out the equivalent of multiple major cities in a single night? Does it change how you think about the fragility of the communities we build? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I genuinely read every single one. But here is the question that historians struggled with for centuries. If this disaster was so enormous, why did almost nobody in later history know it had happened? There is a phenomenon in historical memory that researchers sometimes call catastrophe amnesia. It works like this. When a disaster kills the people who experienced it most directly, and those survivors who remain are too poor, too scattered, or too illiterate to put their account into writing, the disaster tends to vanish from collective memory. Not because it wasn't important, not because it wasn't devastating, but because the people who lived through the worst of it had no way to make the written record. The scribes who could write were safely on higher ground. The fishermen and salt workers who drowned in their beds could not. The flood of 1099 is a nearly perfect case study in catastrophe amnesia. Consider the logistics of historical memory in medieval Europe. Events were recorded by scribes, monks, and clergymen, educated men in institutions that were, by necessity, built on stable, elevated ground. The monasteries and cathedral schools that produced medieval historians were not located on the low-lying coastal flats where the worst flooding occurred. They were in cities, on hills, in river valleys protected from direct tidal exposure. The people who died in the greatest numbers on the 23rd of November, 1099, the coastal fishing communities, the salt workers, the farmers of the reclaimed polders, were largely illiterate. They left no written records. Their deaths went unrecorded, except as aggregate statistics in the financial accounts of nobles and bishops, who suddenly found their coastal estates depopulated. The entries that do survive are remarkable for their brevity. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, compiled at various English monasteries, gives the 1099 flood approximately 2 sentences. 2 sentences for one of the worst natural disasters in English history. For comparison, the same chronicle spends paragraphs describing court politics and ecclesiastical disputes of the same year events that, in historical consequence, rank considerably below the deaths of tens of thousands of people. This is not carelessness, this is priority. In the worldview of a medieval monk, the flood was an act of God, divine punishment, divine will, divine mystery. It required acknowledgement, not analysis. You noted it. You prayed. You moved on. The theological framework of the period actively discouraged the kind of systematic inquiry that would have made better disaster records possible. Medieval people also lacked one crucial tool for understanding what had happened: comparative data. They had no way of knowing, in 1099, that what had struck them was a once-in-a-century storm surge. They had no tide gauges, no weather stations, no atmospheric pressure measurements. They knew the sea had risen in an unusual way. They did not know why. And without understanding why, they could not predict if or when it would happen again, which meant they could not make a compelling argument to future communities for why building on the coast was exceptionally dangerous. So they rebuilt. Of course they did. Where else would they go? The fishing was still in the sea. The salt was still in the tidal flats. The trade routes still ran along the coast. Within a generation, new communities had risen on the same low-lying land, often incorporating the ruins of the old. Children grew up hearing stories about the great flood their grandparents had survived, but stories fade. By the time those children had grandchildren of their own, the flood of 1099 had become legend, then rumor, then nothing. Here is the quietly devastating part. The North Sea coast would flood catastrophically again in 1287. The Street, Lucia's flood, which killed an estimated 50,000 to 80,000 people, and is one of the deadliest natural disasters in European history, and again, in 1362, in the Grote Mandrenki, the Great Drowning of Men, which erased entire islands off the coast of what is now Germany and Denmark. And again, most notoriously, on the 1st of February, 1953, when the North Sea storm surge of that year killed over 2,000 people in the Netherlands and England in a single night, 850 years after 1099. The same coastline, the same type of storm, the same mechanics of disaster, and people were still dying because the warning systems were inadequate. Catastrophe amnesia has a body count. Here's something I want you to think about. How many other historical disasters have been completely erased from our memory simply because the people who experienced them couldn't write it down? It's a question that genuinely unsettles me. Tell me what you think in the comments. But forgetting the disaster was only one layer of the tragedy. The deeper layer, the one that historians rarely discuss, is what the aftermath revealed about how medieval society actually treated its survivors. Let's be uncomfortable for a moment, because the flood of 1099 didn't end when the water receded. For the people who survived, and survival, in this case, was frequently a matter of pure chance, of sleeping in the right room, of owning livestock that happened to be stabled on slightly higher ground. The disaster was only beginning. Medieval disaster relief did not work the way modern disaster relief works. There was no FEMA. There was no Red Cross. End quote. There was no government apparatus of any kind designed to mobilize resources toward affected communities. What existed instead was a complex, hierarchical system of feudal obligation, and that system, in the aftermath of a catastrophic flood, worked almost entirely against the people who needed help most. Here is how it worked, and why it was so merciless. Under the feudal system that governed most of 11th century England and the Low Countries, a peasant's primary obligation was to the land specifically, to the lord whose land they farmed. They paid rent in labor and in kind. They owed military service. They owed a percentage of every harvest. In return, the lord theoretically owed them protection, and, in times of crisis, some measure of support. The key word is theoretically. When the flood destroyed coastal farmland, it did not merely kill people. It destroyed the economic foundation of entire lordships. Fields that had produced grain and livestock were now beneath feet of salt water. Salt water, critically, is not like freshwater flooding. Freshwater flooding damages land temporarily. Saltwater flooding poisons the soil. Fields inundated by seawater in 1099 would have been unproductive for years, in some cases, decades. The salt had to leach out of the topsoil naturally, a process that could take anywhere from 5 to 20 years, depending on rainfall and drainage. Lords who had lost their agricultural base were not in a position to be generous, and generosity, in the feudal calculus, was never really the point anyway. A lord's relationship to his peasants was economic, not charitable. When those peasants could no longer produce, they stopped being assets and became liabilities, mouths to feed, obligations to honor, claims to manage. The shift from indifference to active hostility was, in that framework, almost logical. They were, in many documented cases, actively hostile to the survivors who remained on their land, people who represented ongoing expenses without any corresponding productive output, survivors who could not pay their feudal obligations because their fields were ruined, their livestock drowned, their tools washed away, faced a brutal choice. They could remain on the land and hope their lord was merciful enough to defer their debts. They could flee to a nearby town or city and hope to find work, which usually meant arriving as destitute refugees in communities that had their own problems and no particular obligation to help. Or they could die slowly of starvation and exposure, which many did. The chronicles from the years immediately following 1099 describe an unusual surge in the urban populations of inland English towns. An influx of people described variously as beggars, wanderers, and the displaced poor. These were the flood survivors, people who had walked away from the coast with nothing, looking for a way to survive in an economic system that had no category for them. There are records from the Diocese of Lincoln, one of the English ecclesiastical districts most affected by the flooding of church courts, hearing cases as late as 1103 and 1104 involving disputes over abandoned land, fields that had belonged to dead families, property claims from lords whose tenants had simply vanished, legal arguments over whether a lord was entitled to reclaim land that had been washed beneath the sea. The sea had taken people's homes. The legal system then came for whatever was left. This is not ancient history in the sense of being irrelevant. Every major natural disaster of the modern era, Hurricane Katrina in 2005, the 2011 Tohoku tsunami in Japan, the European floods of 2021, has produced eerily similar dynamics. The poorest communities, built on the most vulnerable land, suffer disproportionate losses. The recovery resources flow unevenly. The displaced become invisible. The legal and economic systems that were built for stable times prove strangely, persistently hostile to people in crisis. Medieval feudalism and modern disaster capitalism are not the same thing, but they rhyme. I want to pause here and ask you directly, does the way medieval society treated flood survivors remind you of anything you've seen in more recent history? I think the parallels are striking, and I'd love to know if you see them too. Comment below seriously. This is the kind of conversation that makes these videos worth making. And what the 1099 flood left behind wasn't just bodies and ruined fields. It left something in the land itself, something that 20th century engineers would spend decades trying to undo, and something that climate scientists today say is coming for us all over again. You are standing, once again, at the edge of the North Sea coast. But this time, it is not 1099. It is now. The year is 2026. The coastline you are standing on looks completely different from what it looked like 1,000 years ago, not because the architecture has changed, though it has, but because the actual shape of the land has changed. The islands, the inlets, the harbors, the estuaries, the entire physical geography of this coastline is, in significant part, the product of what the sea did in 1099 and in the floods that followed it. The Zuiderzee, that great inland sea shaped by centuries of North Sea flooding, with 1099 among its most violent early chapters, was finally reclaimed by Dutch engineers, beginning in 1927, when construction of the Afsluiting started. The 2-0-mile barrier dam was completed in 1932, after 5 years of construction. The IJsselmeer it created now covers land that was open sea for the better part of a millennium. Beneath that reclaimed farmland, deep in the silted layers of the former seabed, archaeologists have found the ruins of communities that existed before the floods began. Villages, farmsteads, roads, entire lives preserved in mud and salt, waiting to be rediscovered by people who did not know they had been lost. In England, the geography of the Wash, that broad coastal inlet in Lincolnshire and Norfolk, still reflects the catastrophic flooding of the late medieval period. Land that had been productive farmland before 1099 is, in some areas, still marginal and flood-prone. The drainage systems built by medieval survivors and their descendants are still, in modified form, part of the infrastructure that keeps parts of eastern England above water today. This matters because of something climate scientists and civil engineers have been discussing with increasing urgency for the past 2 decades: sea level rise. The North Sea storm surge of 1099 was a short-term, weather-driven event. The sea rose catastrophically for a period of hours and then receded. What the modern coastline faces is different in character and potentially more dangerous. A slow, permanent, sustained rise in mean sea level, driven by the thermal expansion of warming oceans and the melting of polar ice sheets. The same low-lying coastal areas that were devastated in 1099, the Dutch polders, the English fens, the Thames estuary, are among the most vulnerable coastlines in the world to modern sea level rise. The Dutch, more than any other people on Earth, have internalized the lesson of 1099 and its successors. The Delta works a massive system of storm surge barriers, sluices, and dikes. Constructed after the catastrophic 1953 flood, is considered one of the greatest engineering achievements of the 20th century. The Maes Landkering, a pair of movable barrier arms that can be closed to protect Rotterdam from storm surges, is roughly the size of 2 Eiffel Towers laid on their sides. In its first 3 decades of operation since its 1997 completion, it has been activated in earnest only a handful of times. Each closure a reminder of exactly what it was built for. When it was designed, engineers built it to withstand what they calculated as a 1 in 10,000 year event, a storm surge, so extreme it had only a 0.01% chance of occurring in any given year. They designed it for conditions that, in 1099, would have seemed like divine punishment. They designed it because they remembered. Not everyone does. The United States, whose Gulf Coast and eastern seaboard face real and documented flood risk from both storm surges and sea level rise, has historically underinvested in the kind of permanent, engineered coastal defenses that the Netherlands considers basic infrastructure. The reasons are political, economic, and cultural. They are also, in a way that cuts deeper than policy, a product of the same catastrophe amnesia that erased the flood of 1099 from popular memory. When a disaster happens in your grandfather's time, it is history. When it happens in your great-great-great-great-grandfather's time, it is mythology. When it happens to people whose names you do not know on land that no longer exists in the same shape, it is nothing at all until the water comes again. There is a specific phrase used in modern Dutch water management culture that I find genuinely haunting. It has no perfect English translation, but it refers to the responsibility of each generation to maintain the defenses built by previous generations, and to improve them for future ones. The underlying assumption, the assumption baked into Dutch civil engineering at a philosophical level, is that the sea never stops trying. It is patient. It has time. Every generation of engineers is simply buying time for the next one. The people of the North Sea coast in 1099 were not ignorant. They were not careless. They were not primitive. They were doing exactly what their parents and grandparents had taught them to do, in a system that had worked, more or less, for generations. The sea simply exceeded what their experience had prepared them for. That sentence should feel familiar. It should feel contemporary. Because the defining challenge of the next century is going to be human communities trying to manage risks that exceed the range of their recent experience. Risks that are new in their scale, but ancient in their mechanics. Risks that the flood of 1099 AD understood 1,000 years before we were ready to listen. Before we wrap up, I want to ask you something important. After learning all of this, the engineering, the failures, the survivors, the erasure, what's the single most important lesson you think we should carry forward from the flood of 1099? I read every comment on this channel, and this is exactly the kind of question I love hearing your answers to. Don't be shy. And now we return to where this story began, to that last normal night in November 1099. But this time, I want you to notice one detail you may have missed. One detail that changes everything about what the flood of 1099 actually means. Do you remember the beginning of this story? You were standing at the edge of the North Sea coast. The wind was cold. Your children were asleep. The fire was low. The sea was doing what the sea always does, rising and falling with the moon, ancient and obedient and utterly predictable. Here is the detail I held back until now. The patron saint whose feast day fell on the 23rd of November, 1099 Street. Clement, claimed by sailors, symbolized by an anchor, was, according to tradition, a man who died by drowning. Thrown into the sea by his executioners, tied to an iron anchor, swallowed by the water without warning. The coastal communities who gathered on his feast day to pray for protection from the sea were, without knowing it, praying on the very night the sea would remind them of exactly what it was capable of. The patron saint of those who feared drowning could not save the people who honored him. History does not do irony gently. Here is the thing about the people who died in the flood of 1099 that I keep coming back to. They were doing everything right. They had built their homes on the best available technology. They had organized their communities around the best available knowledge. They had lived with the sea long enough to respect it, to understand it, to build their entire civilization around its rhythms. They were not victims of their own ignorance. They were victims of a gap, the gap between what the world had shown them so far and what the world was actually capable of. That gap exists in every era. It exists in ours. The flood of 1099 was forgotten not because it was unimportant, but because the people who experienced it had no way to make the rest of the world understand what had been lost. The salt water took their homes, their families, their livelihoods, and then history took their story. We are giving it back. If this video made you think, if it made you uncomfortable, or curious, or quietly unsettled in the way that good history sometimes does, please consider leaving a comment below. This channel lives and grows through the conversations you start in the comments section. Tell me what surprised you. Tell me what made you angry. Tell me what you'll think about the next time you stand near the ocean and watch the tide do what it has always done. And if you want more stories like this one, stories about the disasters, the decisions, and the human beings that history tried to forget, subscribe to Ancient Wrath. Because the past is never as simple as we were told. And the water, as it turns out, never really goes away. It just waits.